More mobility and more flexibility is not always better. Imagine you had a higher left hip, you had lateral pelvic tilt, and now this is higher on the left side, and this muscle right here is your groin muscle. Now, this muscle all of a sudden is in a stretched orientation because this hip is now higher. So some people could perceive this tightness that they feel as if they need to stretch this muscle out. They need to elongate it further, but really what's happening underneath the surface is that this muscle is now stretched. It's like a rope being pulled from both ends. And now it feels tight, not because it's short, but because it's long. Here's the thing, muscles need to be able to have a degree of resting slack in them at a neutral position of rest. And according to just a basic concept like length-tension relationships, muscles need to be able to have this slack to contract and pull down or elongate and stretch out. If we're starting in a position of excessive length, then this muscle, in order to contract and pull down, first needs to overcome its disadvantageous starting position of length. Muscles do need to stretch to some relative degree in order to contract optimally, but if that's too much and we're way up here and let's say this groin muscle needs to contract, it's going to be disleveraged to be able to do that effectively. This concept right here can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, but in order for us to keep things simple and understandable, we're going to focus on who this happens to, what it looks like, and what we can do about it using a few basic examples. When it comes to people that have a ton of hypermobility and flexibility, I tend to see three main things. And this is not always the case. This is just what I see most commonly with the people I train and the people that I assess on a regular basis. People that have a lot of mobility tend to be able to do three things. The first one is that they can squat ass to grass, no problem. Their body weight squat, they just go all the way butt to heels, and it tends to look pretty easy for them. And a lot of people tend to just fall into the bottom of that squat. The other thing that I see is that these people have a huge active straight leg raise. So if they were to lay on their back and they were to keep their legs straight perfectly and pull this leg back, they would get past 90 degrees. They could be upwards of 110, 120 degrees even. And we'll talk about why in a second, but the third thing that I see is these people can palm the floor in their toe touch. If they were to stand up, keep their legs pretty straight, and then go to touch their toes, they can often palm the floor with at least their full hand, if not their forearm a little bit as well. And this is all representative of a strategy of muscles that are chronically elongated. So with these people that can squat all the way down, ass to grass, no problem, they tend to have a pelvis that's biased towards external rotation. So if you look at a deep full squat, the low back tends to be pretty flat in that bottom position, or there's a slight round where it's tucked under. So with these people, they tend to have a bias towards external rotation of the pelvis. But here's the thing, in order to come out of that, in order to produce force, we need to be able to alternate between external rotation and then internal rotation. At the bottom of a squat, we need to be able to be here, and then pushing out of it, we move towards internal rotation, which helps us produce that force. So generally, these people will be able to squat very deeply, but if you were to place a bar on their back and load them up, they would struggle to maintain that because they can't produce sufficient internal rotation through the squat. So if you looked at what happened with this pelvis here in external rotation, in order for us to produce force, we need to be able to do this. These bones need to come inwards, and then this femur right here needs to slide inwards, and the sacrum bone right here needs to come forwards like that. A way we can compensate into that, and what you'll commonly see with these types of people, is that they'll just dump their pelvis forward on both sides, which allows them to pick up leverage to internally rotate, but they're using their low back a lot of the times to do that. What's interesting is this actually feeds into the straight leg raise and toe touch being massive in terms of range of motion. Let's take this same example of this band right here. Before we were talking about the adductor, which attaches on the front side of the pelvis. Now we're going to talk about the hamstring, which attaches on the back right here. But we can still use this band. So if I go forward into an anterior pelvic tilt, what's going to end up happening? I'm going to elongate this hamstring. It's going to be chronically elongated, so we might feel like, oh man, I need to stretch those hamstrings out. But really, this muscle is chronically elongated. Similarly to the groin on this side in the first example. The most common type of person I see run into issues with hypermobility is someone who was a former dancer or a former gymnast, and then they try to go into the weight room and pick up a bunch of heavy weight, which is taking them from this stage of puberty in their lives where they were developing hypermobility for a good reason, into something where now they have to produce a lot of force, a lot of internal rotation of the pelvis in order to lift heavy weights. That's just one example, but it's actually more common than you think. What I found to work the best is two things primarily. One, if they're in a big anterior pelvic tilt, we should probably work to take them out of that first, because then we can get them to genuinely internally rotate that pelvis without needing to rely on extension to do so. So if they're not in a big anterior pelvic tilt, if they have more of a flat back, you probably want to restore internal rotation out of the gate, but take care of that anterior pelvic tilt first if that is present, and I have a lot of material on that. I talk about the importance of internal rotation quite a bit, but let's use a squat as an example of when we actually need it. When we're at the bottom, we're here, biased towards external rotation. But as we push out of it, the hardest point of a squat is what? When our thigh is parallel to the floor and 90 degrees of hip flexion, we need to produce that internal rotation to push back out of it, back into relative external rotation. So in order to restore internal rotation, it'd probably be a good idea to help bias 90 degrees of hip flexion and positions that facilitate internal rotation muscles. Then we're getting the best of both worlds. The other thing I found to work quite well is adding tempo to their exercise. Let's say they're doing a squat. Can you control it for 3 to 5 seconds on the way down, 3 to 5 seconds on the way up? That will help them create that compression, internal rotation force, that shortening of musculature that's probably elongated, and then controlling that through a range of motion will help that carry over towards more of their life as opposed to just flying through the movements like they probably want to do. A perfect example of this would be a weighted squat to a 90-degree box or bench with a ball between the knees, or a foam roller. And that looks like this. This is the heels elevated goblet squat to a 90-degree box with a object in between the knees. We're constraining the body into a position here where we are biasing internal rotation of the pelvis at the bottom position. So we're going to add a little pause at the bottom of this position to help bias more internal rotation of the hips. So to start here, we want to get on some wedges, but you could also just use 5-pound plates and put your heels on them. And you want somewhere around 1 inch to 2 inches of elevation, whatever is going to help you stay stacked, meaning that your rib cage is directly over your pelvis. You can maintain a slight pelvic tilt. So, Key, go ahead and hold that that weight right there in a goblet squat position. And then what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you inhale at the top through your nose. Good. Exhale, squat down, letting those knees come forward. Good. Light tap. Hover right there for an inhale. Exhale, come up. What that roller is doing is it's providing a reference for them to still stay upright. They still need to not extend, but they also need to create internal rotation. So by holding that ball there, they're just biasing this a little bit on the way down and holding that as they come up. That's going to help them go through the relative motion of internal to external rotation and back down again. Let's go back to the beginning of this video where we talked about this elongated inner groin right here. Instead of stretching this out, what we could think about doing instead is actually turning this muscle on more, because that's going to help pull this pelvis down, restore that slack, and then also neutrality within the pelvis. So we can do that through a position which biases this muscle shortening, which ironically is within internal rotation at 90 degrees of hip flexion. A 90-90 Copenhagen plank can be a really good way to do that. This is the 90-90 Copenhagen plank. The purpose of this activity is to provide strength to the adductor, inner groin muscle, as well as the side abs, the obliques on the down side. These muscles actually work together when we walk and run, so getting the same side adductor with the opposite side oblique is actually good for rotational movements when we walk or run. So to set up here, we want to have a bench, and we want our knee to be at about a 90-degree angle relative to the bench. And then our trunk is going to be parallel with the bench. That's going to secure our hips at a 90-degree bend, keep a 90-degree bend and also the knee. Now, Kyle, I'll have you dig down into the bench with this knee right here, keeping the rest of your leg relatively relaxed and also pushing through the floor with that right elbow. Simultaneously pushing right there is going to give him recruitment of his inner groin on the left leg right here, as well as his right ab wall. Now, making sure those shoulders are stacked, breathe through it nice and controlled. I like how you're putting your hand on your low ribs right there, because that is allowing you to make sure that those ribs aren't flaring. If those ribs flare and you feel it pushing to your hand, then that's a good indication that you're probably arching your low back and you're losing your stacked shoulders over your hips. The most common mistakes we see on this activity is letting this shoulder, this top shoulder, roll too far forward. That's probably going to have you lose good and optimal recruitment of that downside ab wall. Another thing we see is letting this bottom leg drop excessively. If that happens, it's actually going to make the exercise a lot easier, and you're not actually going to utilize as much adductor on this top leg right here. As you lift that leg up, it should stay in line with your bottom hip. And also, you might feel a little adductor on that leg as you do it, but you should feel significantly more on this top leg. Just make sure that everything is stacked and the knee is in line with the hip on both legs. The way you would know if you're making progress is if your straight leg raise gets worse. That's right, worse, because that's a sign that the hamstring has more tension on it. That's a sign that you are probably going to go through the motions of your pelvis rather than flinging the leg back. Also, your toe touch should still be full. You should still be able to touch your toes, but it shouldn't be so much where you can get your forearm or elbow on the floor. Also, your squat can still remain deep. That should still be present. You should still be able to get your hips below the level of your knees, but you should be able to control it and also produce force through it with load, and that's a great sign of progress.